Assalamu alaikum and good morning, Engineer Aftab Shah with you. And actually, this lecture is a part of the series of the lecture that we started previously, and that was about the history of the literary criticism. And in our previous lecture, we took the introduction of the criticism and the starting point of the history. And we seen that the number one person that is actually known to have started this sort of criticism or literature is Plato. And we study what was the concepts of Plato about literature, about poetry, and what were his ideas about poetry being good or bad for a particular ideal sort of state, the concept that he gave in his famous works. And today we are actually starting from Plato, but this is, by the way, the last slide that we will study about Plato, and after that we will go to his disciple, that is Aristotle. And the last slide of Plato is about the main areas of interest of the Plato. Number one, the number one interest that the Plato has was the function of poetry or literature in a society. What is actually the function of poetry? According to Plato, the function of literature or in their time actually, the poetry, it should be to bring the people near to the reality, not to take them away from reality. This was actually the purpose according to Plato of the poetry. And what are the main influences? The Plato actually initiated the still existing debate on the values, nature, and worth of literature. And this was actually supposed to be the Plato who started a debate on what a poetry should be, or a drama should be, or a part of literature should be. Either it should be a mirror of the society, or it should give a new direction to the society, etc. And of those who produce works of literature. And he also talked about the author, that a person, what are the qualities a person should have if he wishes to produce or to write some sort of literary texts. And now we have the catchphrase actually. What are the major ideas put forward by Plato? And poetry is the imitation of the imitation. According to Plato, it's a double imitation, that all the physical world around us is actually an imitation. It's not the real world. And secondly, he told that poetry is actually, since it's representing the physical world around us, so it's an imitation of the imitation. So it's a double imitation. Number one idea from Plato. Number two, we have poetry is twice distance from the ultimate reality. And this is the reason that the Plato was actually willing to exile and send out all the poets from his ideal state that he gave the concept. He said, in my state, there would be no poets. So the major concept, the two concepts that Plato gave are, number one, poetry actually is a double imitation of reality, and second concept, it's actually two times away from reality. And now we go to the disciple or the student of Plato, that is actually called Aristotle, and we call him in Urdu Arastu, and the Plato in Urdu is called Aflatun. Actually, these two guys are from Greek period, and they are, one of them, Plato is a teacher and Aristotle is his student. Aristotle actually, in many of the aspects of literature, he disagreed with his teacher. That means he disagreed with Plato. According to Aristotle, in Poetics, Aristotle states that the general principles of tragedy, as he saw them at that time, in accordance with his principles of philosophy, actually. What he said that actually the Plato, he gave one single name to literature, that was poetry. But Aristotle actually, he gave another name to the poetry, that was tragedy. He said this is a particular type of poetry in which we have the features which are different from other types of poetry. The other type of poetry, that's called comedy. These were two major categories that were advocated by the Aristotle. He said one is called tragedy, another one is called comedy. And he gave separate principles for tragedy and for comedy. And the principle for tragedy, he said that the main concepts, he said that mimesis. Mimesis is one of the main concepts of Aristotle. According to that, all poetry is a mimicry. It is a copy, or it is an imitation, the almost similar concept with the Aristotle, with the Plato, which gathers all the parts under the roof of imitation. This means all poetry, all tragedy, all comedy, they are all imitations. In this, Aristotle agrees with Plato. Of course, the Plato said poetry is an imitation, and Aristotle also said poetry is an imitation. However, as Plato sees the art of poetry as a potential threat against the order in society, because the Plato said that it is an imitation of the imitation. It is two times imitation of reality. So since it is two-time imitation of reality, it's taking people away from the real stuff. So he said that it is not beneficial for society because it's not taking the people towards reality. It's taking them away from reality. So it's dangerous for the society. However, for Aristotle, it may prove helpful in improvement of the society. It's about the function. It's not about the nature. The Plato says that poetry is an imitation. Aristotle agreed, okay, poetry is an imitation. But according to Plato, the purpose of poetry is not for the betterment of his society, but the purpose of poetry is for the detriment of his society. So he said that I will banish all the poets from my state. Here, actually, the Aristotle disagrees with Plato. Plato says the purpose of poetry is not for the betterment of the state or the society, but Aristotle said, no, the poetry can be used to improve our society. How it is improved or how it can improve our society, this we are going to see in the coming stages, actually coming slides. Here we see. This disagreement has its roots in the differing approaches of those two philosophers. They have a different approach actually. What are the approaches towards the idea of imitation? Imitation is same, but the definition of imitation is different. Against Plato's idea that imitation is two steps removed from the truth or realm of the ideal, Plato said it's a two times away, it's a two times or two parts away from the reality. Aristotle deems that the poetry is more universal, more general than things as they are. He said that in poetry or in literature actually, we are exploring the ideas which are not related to a particular place, are related to a particular person. Rather, they are of general nature, they are of universal nature. They are same here and same anywhere else, and they are same anytime else in the history. So we cannot say that it is an imitation of this particular thing. Rather, we would say that poetry is an imitation of the universal values, the values which everybody has. For example, the values like jealousy, like love, like revenge, antagonism, and so many other things. So poetry is an imitation but of general values, not of particular values. For it is not the function of the poet to relate what happened, but what may happen, what is possible according to the law of probability or necessity. Here is the difference actually. Plato said that the poet's function is to imitate what has already happened. But Aristotle says, no, this is not the function of the poet to imitate what has already happened only. But he can imitate what could have happened, or what will happen, or what can happen. Not only one particular dimension of happenings, but all the possible dimensions of happening. So poetry is not giving us information about history only. It's also giving us information about what could have been done, the other part, other side of the picture that the people normally don't see. So poetry is something that can open the door to our hidden potentials by showing us the ways and the pictures which are normally not seenable or which are normally not available to the general masses. I think it's a bit clear now. Both the philosophers, they say that poetry is imitation of reality. But according to Plato, poetry is imitating what has already happened. But according to Aristotle, the poetry does not only imitate what has already happened, it also imitates what could have happened, what will happen, or what the possibilities are there. So it's not only one dimension. The poetry can give us all the possible dimensions. So that's why poetry can improve our imagination much better way than the reality itself. And here we go, and here we see that necessity or probability, comparing it with history. In history actually says that, Aristotle says that if the poetry is only talking about what has already happened, so it's like an history. It's like a history. It's not a poetry. The function of poetry is not to tell us what has already happened. The function of a poetry is also to tell us what could have happened, what would have happened, or what can happen, or what will happen. It's actually touching our imagination. Here we go. Aristotle concludes that poetry is a more philosophical and therefore higher thing. So according to this definition of imitation, that poetry not only gives us one side of the picture, but all the possible sides of the picture. So according to this definition, Aristotle says that poetry is higher. It's not something that is bad for our society, but it improves our faculty of imagination. It gives us these dimensions which are normally not possible under normal circumstances. This is because the historian writes of what has already happened, whereas the poet writes of what could and should happen. This is actually the key word of this slide. Aristotle explains it as the tendency of poetry to explore the universal. He says that poet is not a person who can just focus on a particular idea in a particular place. No. A poet is a person who can analyze and explain and write about the general values of humanity. The values which are not bound to any particular place, and the values which are not bound to any particular time of history. They are universal. Like right now, we study after 2,500 years, we are studying Oedipus Rex. We are studying Homeric hymns. We are studying about trilogies of Greek period. Why? And why we are studying them after 2,500 years? And why we are studying them here in this eastern part of the world? Because the values presented in those arts, in those form of arts, they are universal. They are not bound to Greek country only or to that particular time of span only. They are universal. It's not only us or not only we who are reading those literature, but even the people who are coming after us, they will be reading those literature as well, because they are not time-bound. And this is the idea put forward by Aristotle. Aristotle said that a literature is an imitation like Plato, no problem, but it is an imitation of universal values, universal concepts, general concepts that are neither place-bound nor time-bound. So this is what is mentioned actually here when Aristotle explains it is the tendency of the poetry to express the universal with respect to the universal truth, as history tends to express the particular, namely what happened in a particular case. He is actually here giving us a difference between history and poetry as well. I think I've been able up to my ability to explain what I understand from these two big philosophers. They are the wonderful philosophers of Greek history. And by the way, in reality, we can try to give our understanding of their concepts, but their concepts are much more higher. So this is a humble struggle from my side to explain what I understand, what the Plato was thinking about literature and what Aristotle was thinking about literature. And with this, we just finish our today's lecture. The next lecture will inshallah come after a couple of days. And if you people have any comments or suggestions, you can write them in our comment box. Really wish you all the best and see you next time. Thank you and bye-bye.